All right, good evening, everyone. Happy, hopefully, Sunday afternoon is treating you restfully and successfully, and I appreciate you joining us today, even though that may be the case. If this is taking you kind of out of that relaxation, good for you. Thanks for joining us. If this is just a continuation of some work you've been doing on a Sunday, even better. Here's hoping that a good portion of it helps. While people are starting to jump on here, take a look at the poll question, a little bit of just a would you rather question. Would you rather eat things that are only pink or things that are only things that are blue? A student posed this question to us in an advisory period the other day, and I really liked it. All sorts of various things could come about, be it, you could have cotton candy that's either pink or blue. Maybe blueberries specifically, make sure that you're getting, fruits and vegetables in there. I also thought of, something like a steak could even be cooked very quickly to be blue or to be kind of a rare, medium rare pink. So would you rather eat only pink things or only blue things? While people are jumping on here today, we're going to be getting in today to poetry instruction. I want to right from the outset, as I see a bunch of people jumping on, I want to right from the outset just sort of address a question that we got in our last poetry session, which was about any sort of differences given poetry as we go through the differences between the online version of the exam and the paper and pencil version of the exam. And I said this in another one of the fiction crams that we've been doing. But they're actually while many other contents do have some noticeable differences in how the test is going to be set up, that's not going to be the case for the lit test. It's going to be pretty much the same thing. The only difference is how you're taking it. So with that being said, many of the structures that we're going to take a look at today, and many of the structures that we're building in here, are things that are meant to be helpful to you just as you're reading, to help you move through the questions in an effective way. So let's see where we're at with regard to this. And it looks as though a lot only pink. I suspect cotton candy and steak may come in there. Salmon, delicious. And for those of you who are looking at blue things, maybe that's again thinking about blueberries and things like that. So let's take a look here as we get going. Remember, thank you for participating in that poll. But if you're taking a look in the chat, obviously we want you to be doing that. We want you to be keeping that community going. Ask questions in the chat. Obviously, there's a Q&A function, but the chat, it makes it really easy for me to sort of see things in real time as you're going through these. Certainly, we want to welcome Gayatri, who's in here with us today. As always, she'll be hanging out in the chat as well, and can answer some questions for you in there. And one of the things that I've really loved the most about all of you joining us is how many of you sort of pose questions on each other's analysis. And so that's been really, really helpful, because it makes sure to bring in things that one instructor may say, something that I may not think to say, something that one of your teachers may say that another teacher didn't say. Certainly, as I always say, no one's going to have all of the answers, but all of us working together will likely come close to as many of the answers as we can, especially when it comes to literature. It's all about interpretations. But if you do take a look at that, at joining us in that chat feature, just make sure that you realize that your name may appear on the screen, and you want to change that. Also, be sure, as always, to join us at our various social accounts on @ThinkFiveable, and be sure to communicate with us in there and be part of that group and that community. Coming up, just a quick reminder. I know I said this again. If you were with us the other night, again, welcome back. But just as a reminder, when it comes to our trivia sessions, again, I'll post some links at the end of this, but that'll be for poetry. Our trivia will happen tomorrow night. if you look at that and you see, oh, it's always the day after, just remember that our next CRAM will be on Friday evening, April 2nd. We'll be focusing on a lot of multiple choice there. So looking at some excerpts, and we'll talk about just how to read excerpts in general, but specifically we'll be focusing a little bit on multiple choice there. So definitely feel free to join us. Just know that even though that trivia is next Monday, the CRAM session will be this Friday. So just be aware of that, and try to keep yourself up to speed on that scheduling. So I appreciate you joining us then as well. Today we're going to be looking at a couple of different forms of poetry, and just in terms of structure. The first time that we talked, we looked through how to read a poem, but in particular we focused on sonnets. Today I'm going to give you a couple of different poetic devices that we might touch on here, just something to have in your back pocket, and we'll work through some examples of where those come into play, but also again, just the more and more and more that we read and we do, and we just keep talking about any of the work and any of the excerpts that we do talk about, the better off we all are. To be working through these pieces, to be working through the various excerpts that we touch on in our fiction CRAMs, all of that repetition is just how we ultimately prepare for this exam, is to be able to talk about anything that happens to come at us. So we'll do a little bit of that today, and I'll hopefully be able to touch on something unique in each of those poems. As a start, let's take a look at a couple of pieces of terminology that we can be bringing in. Apostrophe is when a speaker is addressing an inanimate object, something that can't talk back. And this isn't necessarily, in a manner of speaking, it is a poetic example. But if you think about Hamlet, you can look at obviously the soliloquy. Even if you've never read Hamlet, you've seen this in pop culture. Someone addressing a skull, talking at the skull and sort of waxing poetic or waxing nostalgic in that. That's an apostrophe. Blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. So there's still that meter. There's still that iambic pentameter, that stressed and unstressed syllable repetition, but the difference being that there's no rhyme. So it looks like there's just the poet is just sort of telling a story, and there's various line breaks. But really, as you go through it, you're recognizing where those line breaks are coming deliberately. I hope that I've said this before, but if I haven't, one of the things that you want to really take notice of in poetry is that there are plenty of times where a poet is just sort of setting their own rules just so they can play around in them. Poetry, is, I always talk about with my students about the fact that poetry does have rules, and students say, well, no, it's art, it doesn't have rules. Of course it does. The fact that there are rules is what makes it art. The fact that the poet is doing what they can to play around in that space is the art, is some part of, it's not all of, but it's some part of the artistic function of what makes a poem a poem. Now, again, we don't want to dig into a small garden with a big shovel and just ruin the garden here. So we don't want to focus too much on the fact that there is that meter, but we want to notice it, and we want to notice what's emphasized because it exists. And we want to be able to talk about that part of it. If we can talk about that part of it and say, yeah, here's this blank verse, here's this unrhymed iambic pentameter, and it helps us to understand X, Y, and Z about the poem, that's the more important piece, and that's the thing that's going to help give you something to talk about when we get to when we get onto the actual exam and some of your FRQs. The same is true of a Caesura. It's a pause within a poem, within a line of a poem in particular. So to see a poem that or a line rather, that stops right in the middle, takes a breath, and then continues on, that pause is going to be important to us. Again, it's important because something is being emphasized. Hyperbole, I suspect, is something you're familiar with, at least in your own lives, if not poetically. But it is just exaggeration or overstatement. It's nothing more than what you would expect it to be. Likewise, ambiguity is when something is left undetermined or questioning. It's not if you have questions because you don't necessarily understand a piece of the poem. That part is fine. But the thing that I always talk about when I talk about ambiguity with my students is not just the fact that something is ambiguous, but that ambiguity serves a function. So we'll call it functional ambiguity, that there's something that's being done and something that's being achieved because it's left unknown or it's left unsaid. Again, I always talk about the best definition that I've heard of poetry is saying something and saying it more intensely than any other type of writing can. Where that functional ambiguity comes in is one of the spaces where something can be said really strongly. And so it's okay if there's a part of a poem that you don't understand. We're going to show you today how to work through a poem that you may not understand right off the bat. We're also going to take you through places where there are things that you don't know about a poem, and that's by design. So both of those things are a little bit different here. I've talked about this before, and I mentioned, again, if you were with us last week, or if you've taken a look at some past streams, or maybe if you're someone who does take a look at our streams, but you haven't necessarily hit Unit 4 yet either, let's take a look at this. I've talked about facts, interpretations, and themes, thinking about that here's what language, so what language, and now what language as a place where you can, in your own mind, I wouldn't, say here's what I see. I wouldn't write that down on your actual exam, but I would just be asking yourself, what do I see? What are the facts of this story, of this poem? What are some interpretations? So what? I see that caesura. I see that breath in a line. So what? And then now that I know that, now what else do I know? So I've used these sort of levels of personal questioning. I've used these a couple of times in a couple of our different CRAMs just to set that baseline of language for us. And remember, if you think about this, fit, if you think about that on your exam and you think about the facts that you're trying to determine within the poem, it's going to help you to say something about the poem. That's important. What I want to be doing in these next couple of weeks, as I've said, is that I want to be helping to build out from this kind of basic form of thinking into more specific things to help us to figure out a bit of an outline. So if you're thinking through, pardon me just a moment, if you're thinking through that same sort of facts, interpretations, and themes language, you can also be thinking of TIPCAST. Now, let's pause for a minute. I know that's a lot of acronyms we've gone through, even just in these first 5 units together. The one that I love the most is TIPCAST, because when you're thinking about a poem, you end up, if you're just talking about a poem in class, you end up working through all of this in the first place. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to work through it in this order, but you tend to do that anyway. If you're working through these conversations, as we will today, this is effectively what you end up doing, or even subconsciously what you end up doing. The first thing that you do, or the first thing that you absolutely should do in reading a piece of poetry, is to take a look at the title first. Please always remember that the title is part of the poem. And that's really, really important because it is setting the tone for you. Really, it's a place where you're starting to get that first connotation, that first feeling or mood from the title. There's going to be some connotation that you have with that, even if it's a minimal one, even if it's one that in the moment seems kind of ambiguous and you're not really sure what it means. There's going to be some reaction that you have to that title. So what are those first reactions? As things move along here, these middle pieces are, again, just to help you to take stock and take inventory of what it is that you're looking at in the poem. So you're gonna want to find pieces of imagery. Remember that I've described imagery as language that addresses the senses, and language that helps to create a certain level of degree. Something isn't just hot; maybe it's scorching. It gives you some level of degree, some emphasis on exactly how hot it is, exactly how cold it is, exactly how dark it is, whatever it may be. The thing that I think is going to be really helpful to you, again, thinking about some strategies that you can be using on the exam. One thing to think about is, and especially with poetry, if you're feeling a little lost, or even if you understand the poem a lot and you're feeling overwhelmed by it, to try to reduce it to what it is that you see and can talk about it, to try to recognize some bite-sized pieces that you can turn into an essay. Try to paraphrase it. And now, a rule of thumb, if you're paraphrasing, and this could be something that you're just thinking about on your own, I wouldn't necessarily do this on the exam, but you can write full paragraphs kind of summarizing it. That's not what they're asking you to do. They're asking you to evaluate it. But think about the things that you can recognize. So if you're looking for a quick summary for yourself to manage what it is that you're seeing, count up the number of sentences that you see in the poem. Count up the number of periods, so to speak, and look at that and say, okay, and say, okay, can I talk about this poem in 5 points because I see 5 periods. Let's say that there's like 15 or 20 periods. That's maybe not the best use of your time. Maybe try to count it up in stanzas and do that same thing over stanzas. That doesn't mean that you should talk about what's happening in each stanza, because the shifts may occur in other places. But what this is going to do is it's going to actually help you to recognize where some of those shifts are. It may even help you to recognize a shift that you didn't notice in the first place. And it's a way to help you to manage what it is you're seeing, whether it is that you understand the poem in the first place, or whether it is that you don't understand the poem, you're trying to figure it out. Latch onto and orient yourself using the things that you do know, okay? Listing the things that you see, the facts of the poem, okay? And try to take a look and say, what is it that's important about this? Again, always elevating to that so what language. Remember the connotations. What are the things, what are the words that you're seeing, and what are you feeling as a result of them? Okay, because those are going to give you some level of importance. Noticing really salient or just good words, again, that you can chew on. Noticing those words and saying this is important because can be really helpful. Noticing the attitude, what's the mood of the piece, okay, what words are shaping that tone, and more importantly then, again, attitude and shifts, those are going to go together. So what are the various shifts in tone, shifts in subject, shifts in the speaker? Sometimes that's going to be really obvious because of a line break, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's going to happen right within a single stanza. Maybe the whole poem is one stanza, and so you just have to get the feel of how things are changing. Where do you notice that change? And then again, put it all together. After thinking through all of that, okay, and again, I know that we've been talking here for a minute about this slide, but this is something that you want to get into a practice of, to just be able to jot down some notes, okay, to work through this step by step by step. You want to be careful about, because that's going to eat up some of your time. But to just write TIPCAST down the margin of your paper and take stock again of, okay, did I see some imagery? Check, got it, underline it. Are there words that offer some connotation? Circle them. Okay, do that annotation for yourself and give yourself something to help out with. Again, if you're not really able to annotate for whatever reason, having this there to just kind of take stock. Maybe you quickly list off words that are really offering strong connotations. Maybe you are just sort of writing down a line number where you see a shift, just to give yourself something to anchor onto, to be thinking about as you work through. And then once you yourself have gone through and said, okay, I see all of these things, I see how these things are shifting, I see what the author is maybe trying to get at, do you understand the title differently? Look at the title again. Is something new revealed to you as a result of seeing that title a second time after looking at all of this work? Okay, we use this as an example when we read we read a poem, We Real Cool. It's a good title. It's catchy. There's a lot that you can think about it in that. But then as you start to work through that poem, there's so many questions that we talked about in that first poetry cram about how the word "we" was really important, who the "we" was, why the word "cool" helped contribute to the vibe of the poem. The whole thing came together, and we could talk more knowledgeably about that title by the end of it. We're going to do that a little bit more here in just a moment. I haven't added in a poll question for this slide. I will for our remaining poems. Just for this, as I read through it with you, I'd ask you to do a couple of things. One, I'm going to read through the poem and say it's short enough, so I'll narrate it briefly. Two, I always encourage you to read a poem a second time. Again, thinking about TIPCAST language is a good way to do that. Three, I'd love you to just post any lines or words in the chat that you have a question about, and we'll talk about them when we see that. So as I read, try to think about that. Read it yourself again while we're going through kind of some of the work with it. But most importantly, try to write down any words or lines that you have a question about. On Virtue by Phyllis Wheatley. O thou bright jewel, in my aim I strive to comprehend thee. Thine own words declare wisdom is higher than a fool can reach. I cease to wonder, and no more attempt thine height to explore or fathom thy profound. But, O my soul, sink not into despair. Virtue is near thee, and with gentle hand would now embrace thee, hovers over thine head. Fain would the heaven-born soul with her converse, then seek, then court her for promised bliss. Auspicious queen, thine heavenly pinions spread, and lead celestial chastity along. Lo, now her sacred retinue descends, arrayed in glory from the orbs above. Attend me, Virtue, through my youthful years. Oh, leave me not in the false joys of time, but guide my steps to endless life and bliss. Greatness, or goodness, say what I shall call thee, to give an higher appellation still. Teach me a better strain, a nobler lay, O thou enthroned with cherubs in the realm of day. Take a moment. There's a lot to question here, but if we work through, and I've deliberately tried to selected this poem first because it's a little bit more challenging. Again, we're not necessarily thinking about, if we're thinking through TIPCAST, we're not necessarily thinking about meter or structure per se as our first point of emphasis with this poem. Instead, we're trying to look at something that on its first read through feels a little complicated. It feels complicated to me too, even as an English Lit teacher. So to think through it using TIPCAST can be a way to help. So on Virtue, I think of virtue. I think of the seven virtues the way I think of the seven deadly sins, and I see those two things as opposite. I don't necessarily. I think that we're maybe musing about about virtue. We're thinking on virtue. And so I have this question about, okay, well, which virtue maybe are we thinking about, or are we thinking about virtue in its own right? Even just quickly, I see the word virtue again as I look into the line, and I see it's italicized. So I'm thinking about maybe virtue as maybe a goddess or an attendant that's coming to me. So I've got those things off the top of my head in the first place. Now thinking through some lines of imagery, and to see, okay, can I paraphrase this quickly? And as I look to try to paraphrase it, I see quickly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I see 7, 8, 9, 10 sentences looking at not just periods but also exclamation points. 10 feels like a lot again, but let's see if we can't go through those and try to break them down anyway. I might actually just go for myself, for my own purposes, looking at the first 6 or 7 sentences and then thinking about, because I do notice as I'm trying to think through that, I do notice that looking at those exclamation points, that's actually a place where they just sort of start to come in at the end, and they come in a lot at the end. There's just a quick look. There's 3 of them, and none in the first stanza. Now, even though this slide is a little bit shifted in the terms of the 2 stanzas, even though the stanzas are shifted here, that is where the stanza breaks, is between bliss and auspicious. So I might actually ask myself, okay, can I lump those exclamation points together when I get to them? There must be a shift there, at least in sort of the voice of the poem. So let's go back to the first one to begin with. If I'm looking at those, I've asked myself about virtue. I'll try to find some places where I see can I maybe answer some of my own questions about virtue when it comes to trying to paraphrase a little bit? And again, I see wisdom. I really like this line, thine own words declare wisdom is higher than a fool can reach. And so we think through, okay, I've got a virtue, I've got wisdom as maybe something that is virtuous. And then I also notice that there's, again, as I said, the italicized virtue. And I see a little bit of a relationship maybe between the speaker and the idea of virtue, kind of in the third sentence here. Virtue is near thee. O my soul, sink not into despair. Virtue is near thee, and with the gentle hand would now embrace thee, hovers over thine head. So the speaker is talking about, it actually seems to be talking to their soul and talking about how virtue is kind of in relationship, in some relationship with their soul. Fain would the heaven-born soul with her converse then seek to court her for promised bliss. I almost wonder if that's sort of implying this idea of a contrast between, or a converse between, wisdom and bliss. And so here we've tried to talk through, are there some things that we don't necessarily know? Is there some ambiguity there? And it's not just ambiguity because it's not just ambiguity because there are things that we don't know, but is it ambiguous because it's something that we're meant to be questioning, okay? And so would the heaven-born soul with her converse then then court her for her promised bliss, okay? There's a little bit of there's a want there. There's a question. So that that word would is more of don't wish the heaven-born rather than would the heaven-born. It's not a question. We don't see that question mark, and so we might that just might be an indication to us that word is different there. Let's think about some places where we can see what the attitude of this is in the first place. It is something that seems questioning. It is something that seems like it's attempting to comfort a little bit. But does it shift? And I definitely think it does. And the line break should be the first place that we look for that shift. I talked about how the line break is between bliss and auspicious, and to think about the word auspicious, meaning kind of lucky or fortunate, just in good faith. And so, auspicious queen, thine heavenly pinions spread. For what it's worth, pinions, when we're thinking about that, is a reference to wings. So as you can see, in that sort of angel's wings up in the right hand corner, that's a place that's going to that's some just what a pinion is the point of that wing. And so we see auspicious queen, fortunate queen, thy heavenly pinions spread and lead celestial chastity along. So again, we see another virtue named here and italicized in chastity, but we also see heavenly and celestial that come in here. So there's something, while there is certainly a sort of deified tone in the first stanza, it's a little bit more present here, and it starts to be welcomed and celebratory. And again, here now we see that first exclamation point. I had missed it in the first place when I counted 3. We certainly see this fourth one here with lo, meaning pay attention. Now her sacred retinue descends, arrayed in glory from the orbs above. Attend me, virtue. Pay attention to me, virtue, through my youthful years. Oh, leave me not the false joys of time. Okay, so there's some excitement in either the passing of time, or there's the phrase "youth is wasted on the young." And so if we think back to the ideas of wisdom in the first stanza, we might also be able to think about kind of wanting either that wisdom or that bliss in youth as well. Guide my steps to endless life and bliss, and there it is again, is the remembrance of bliss as well. And so again, if we're thinking about some shifts, we've got probably 3 here so far. Maybe you notice more. I'm noticing 3. One at the end of the first stanza, one just immediately in here at the beginning of the second stanza, and then again as we get into almost a prayer here, praying that virtue is attending to the speaker's soul and guiding them towards greatness, or at least goodness. And so now as we look through and we try to come back from that, we've seen a couple of themes we can talk. If you're trying to take a look at writing about this, you might notice those 3 shifts, and now you maybe see some themes emerging within those shifts. Can you name the themes that are coming out of those shifts? And there you go. If you've got those 3 shifts and you're able to talk about those themes, you've got 3 paragraphs in front of you, and that makes for a pretty solid. It's certainly a very solid outline, but it makes for a pretty solid paper and a pretty solid essay when it comes to your actual FRQ. And then to think back on maybe a thesis that you can write there, can you look back at the title again and say, okay, on virtue, do we know anything new about virtue? Yeah, it's kind of a prayer to virtue. And the prayer that virtue is being asked for is the attendance of being virtuous and wise and happy, not just through the tricks of youth, but also through all time. And so now you can have something that you can say a little bit more easily in terms of trying to create a thesis, trying to create an outline, and trying to put that all together into a full-on essay efficiently if you're practicing with that structure. Again, obviously that took us a second to move through, But once you start to build up that structure, you start to recognize these pieces a little bit more quickly. And really, once you've got an outline, and I tell this to my students on any point, the outline is the hard thing. Okay, writing the essay is the easy thing. If you actually know where you're going to go with it, the essay, it will just sort of come out. And that's especially true with an FRQ, is that you only have so much time. You're not going to be able to go back and revise too heavily. You should check your work, but you're not going to get to revise the way that you would for a term paper or something. And so you want to make sure that as you're that you take the time and invest the time in each FRQ to create an outline, because that's going to help you to make your time efficient. If you need to even jot down something quickly, as you're maybe even running out of time at the end of an exam, knowing what it is that you need to hit will help you to do that. So the outline, while it might take a minute, I can't stress enough, and I don't stress enough to my students, that you have to absolutely take the time to do that work, because it's one of the more important things that you can do. And hopefully using TIPCAST is a way that can help you to get there quickly. Let's take a look again at something a little bit, maybe 100 years later, 150 years later, at W.B. Yeats, The Second Coming. Now, in this one, I have asked for where it is that you notice, where are you starting to notice some of that ambiguity on your own? This poem's a little bit more accessible and approachable, just in terms of the language, because it's in the 20th century a little bit more. So maybe it's a little bit more approachable for you. Is there anything that you're noticing? Certainly there are going to be some questions here. And again, feel free to throw that in the chat if there's a word that I don't touch on that seems confusing and you want to talk about it. But also, where is it that maybe you notice some ambiguity as I read through this? The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? Take a moment as you read through that, and I apologize that I've cut off slouches towards. But where are you noticing some ambiguity in this? One of the points that I want to make sure that I'm making here, again, is ambiguity is where the author wants you to have questions, not necessarily wants you to have questions that are somewhere between kind of level 1 and level 2. For those of you who joined us the other day, and we'll reiterate that a little bit more in future CRAMs as well, but to think through where we see the difference between just plot points and the importance of plot points, characters and the importance of characterization, objects and symbols, where those things differ, is the difference between sort of level 1 and level 2. So what is it that the author is trying to have you fill in the blanks with your own questions and your own sort of analysis as you hear this? For what it's worth, it looks like we actually, and I've noticed maybe 3 or 4 people here on our polls so far today, and I appreciate all of you who are just in attendance. But we're a little bit split here, so let's talk through it. I suspect that, and certainly one person did point out, I suspect that people look at the word, the Latin spiritus mundi. It's sort of the communal spirit of the world, the whole spirit of the whole world together. It just kind of, it comes out of the feeling of the earth is where this image comes out of. But let's pause and let's go back to the beginning here. If we're thinking about TIPCAST, we're thinking about first the title, the second coming. You may, if that's something, and I've had students who see this right away and know what it is that's being referenced, who see it and still kind of maybe have some sort of feeling about it. The second coming is a second coming of a savior, be it whatever religious tradition you're thinking about. It's either, but in this case, it is Christianity, noting that there is there's a God who has come once, and this would be that second coming of God, which is proclaimed for the end of the world. That part is important, that it comes at the end of the world. And if we're thinking about any imagery and attitude that we get in this, that we get from this poem, the end of the world seems pretty near. Taking a look here. So as we look, by the third line, things are falling apart. By the fifth line, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed everywhere. So it gets pretty grim pretty quickly. So we ask, okay, well, turning and the widening gyre. I suspect there's maybe a question there. A gyre is like a gyroscope, where if you've ever seen something that's stabilizing, or if you've ever seen like a camera holder there, or something that's got like 3 rings around it, so that whatever's in the middle stays where it's supposed to be, because it moves along an X, Y, and a Z axis. So it helps to stabilize maybe a camera, or certainly like you see them in space shuttles. They're used a lot. But it's something that gives balance. It's something that gives a center. That's the important thing. And if you've ever seen a bird circling overhead, like a hawk or a vulture or an eagle, or some bird, wherever you're from, where I'm from, I can sit all through the shutdown in Massachusetts last year. As I was teaching from home, I was sitting at the desk I'm sitting at now, and I was looking out the window, and there's an old, I live on top of what used to be the quarry that was owned by John Adams and his family, before it was obviously filled in so many hundreds of years later. But there's a nice little valley in here that's got a bunch of trees, and there were 2 hawks that were living in it, and they would constantly circle overhead, over the trees and over the parking lot. And I would just sort of watch them as I was teaching. But the way that you've seen them circle and circle and circle, as they get higher and higher and higher, those circles become looser and wider. And so if you think about this word gyre, like gyroscope, you can also think of it in terms of like a vortex. And as the falcon gets further away, the center gets less and less defined. Now, in this piece of imagery here, this conversation with the falcon and the falconer, it's some commentary on morality. I suspect, given the second coming, that we could talk about just people and how they're maybe viewing whatever God they ascribe to. It's important to know that this is being written just after World War I, when the whole world seems to have fallen apart. and everything seems like a blood-dimmed tide has been loosed. One of the most notable lines from here is the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So there's a little bit of a breath in that line, and again, if we think about that, a caesura that we can think on here. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And so the best lack all conviction is meant to be juxtaposed against that word, the worst. And then there is, again, like I've said here, I've kept these stanzas true to form. This is the line break between intensity and surely. So surely some revelation is at hand. There's definitely a bit of a tone change there. There's a shift between blood-dimmed tide and revelation. There's some sort of salvation. It's some sort of reckoning or salvation. And so we go through this idea of the second coming when a vast irrigata spiritus mundi, which is, I mean, it's just italicized, it's just Latin, but it's still something that seems dominating and a little grim. And then surely enough, the connotations of the word troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of a desert shape, we get eyes that are blank and pitiless, shadows, the darkness drops again. As we get into these other connotative words like Bethlehem and cradle, they're important words because when we think of Bethlehem, regardless of any sort of religious tradition, you think of Jesus and a Christ figure here. But this is not a while that story is meant to be a positive one, this is certainly not that. This is not positive. This is really, really negative. And so to think about the second coming as a negative thing seems like something demonic, seems like the falconer, in fact, has lost hold of the falcon. And we start to see, again, as we notice these shifts, that's where we start to notice some themes. I want to take a moment. I'm going to move quickly through the next two. That's the function sort of TIPCAST and of trying to think on an outline quickly. But for the next two, there are two points in particular that I want to make with them as it turns into some of the language that we can talk about. So we're going to work through them briefly to make sure that we recognize them. Unfortunately, they are two of my favorite poems, and I don't want to do them a disservice. So let's take a moment here, again thinking about shifts. The Summer Day by Mary Oliver. And as you think through this, which shift stands out to you the most? Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out in the grass. The one who is eating sugar out of my hand. Who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down. Who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do not know how to pay attention, how to fall down. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last, and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Now, I love that, and I love if I'm thinking on a poem like this, if I got a poem, you're not going to get exactly this poem, and if you do, fantastic. Here we are, we're going to talk about it. But if I got a poem like this on the test, something where I notice the pacing of it pretty plainly and pretty quickly, I might start to quick jot down an outline, and I'd ignore any sort of form that we've talked about here. Instead, I would just count the shifts, and I'd say, okay, there's the 3 lines at the beginning that all start with who. There's 2 lines in the middle that start with now. There's the contrast between I don't know what a prayer is and I do know how to pay attention. We start to ask some questions. We start to get into ambiguity. Tell me, what else should I have done? I've been walking through the field all day and admiring life and appreciating a beautiful summer day, and I've had a grasshopper eat out of my hand. Could anything be more wonderful? What else should I have done? And what else are you going to do? I would have gone through and I would have listed, I think, bullet pointed either somewhere between 3 to 5 shifts in this poem, and I would have just tried to go. Where are those shifts, and what am I noticing as I'm working through them? For you all, and I appreciate your contributions in the poll here, for you all, we noticed the line 4 and line 11, and I'm with you on that. I put in line 18 to indicate some a little bit more of that ambiguity. I love the line, I don't know what a prayer is. I think there's a lot to be said between the idea of prayer and communion with the earth, and this is what's going on there, is this communion with this grasshopper. And there's a lot of ambiguity in the beginning. That's why line 4 is important. There's a lot of ambiguity in the beginning. Who made the world is the most ambiguous question there is. There is no more ambiguous question. If you take nothing from today, take that. That ambiguity is something so unknown that it's even as unanswerable as who made the world. Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. And that's where the speaker shifts tremendously. You have who made the grasshopper. We've been in this huge, heady thought for the whole poem. And then to take a look at to say, okay, who made the world? Who made the grasshopper? No, this grasshopper. It completely shifts the attention of the speaker to thinking on creation to just thinking about a grasshopper in front of her. And it takes all of that focus from something huge to something, one of the smallest things that we can just sort of visibly see and interact with. So it's huge to be able to recognize where those shifts are happening, because noticing those shifts is something that's going to help you to talk through a poem. Again, I don't mean to rush through this one either, but I would take a moment. There's something that I do want to take a moment with is there are some important pieces that stick out here. Which do you notice the most? The meter, the line breaks, or the stanza lengths? Let's take a look here. Midterm Break by Seamus Heaney. I sat all morning in the college sick bay, counting bells, knelling classes to a close. At 2 o'clock, our neighbors drove me home. And again, if I'm thinking about TIPCAST, I think midterm break, and I go, great. Maybe you all, depending on your school, you're maybe in the middle of your spring break right now. I know for me, our next break is April, and so I'm sort of thinking about what we're doing between now and then. But midterm break, in any case, it's a time of relaxation. That's the first connotation I'm making. And at the end of classes, my neighbors drove me home. In the porch, I met my father crying. He had always taken funerals in his stride. So we see a couple of things here. We see these 2 M dashes and a really quick tone change. Big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. The baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram. A pram is a stroller, when I came in. And I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand and tell me they were sorry for my trouble. Whispers informed strangers that I was the eldest, away at school, as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. At 10 o'clock, the ambulance arrived, with the corpse staunched and bandaged by the nurses. Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks, paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. No gaudy scars, the bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. So this is, and not to bring us down right at the end of our work here. This is one of my favorite poems. Not for its content, but really just because it is a beautifully structured poem for all the spaces where we can see something and say something about it, for all the places where we can recognize something and recognize we feel something by the end of it, and recognize that we've been feeling something all the way through the whole poem, and it's been changing at a bunch of different points. You all noticed the line breaks, which seem to be going every 3 lines. Okay, so we have these triads that are occurring here, except for the last line. Okay, so it should stand out to you that these line breaks are important and that obviously they are purposeful. And those stanza links should be obviously purposeful as well, because that's where a lot of the tone is coming from. That's a lot of where the shifts are coming from. So if you were looking to quickly, work through this, it's important to recognize all of those different breaks. The thing that is maybe doesn't stand out to you, and clearly it didn't here, and that's fine. The other 2 things are equally important. Remember, I rarely give a right or wrong poll question. But the thing that's really important in terms of the meter, so there's meter, line breaks, and stanza lengths that we had the options to look at here. Meter doesn't stand out, but take a look at it again. I sat all morning in the college sickbay, counting bells, knelling classes to a close. It's iambic pentameter. The whole thing is, and let's go back to obviously the most crushing line, the very last one by itself, a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. It's been iambic pentameter the whole time, but it doesn't rhyme. It is blank verse. And so as we take a look there, remember, it's not so much that we go, oh, it's blank verse, we're done, good, nailed it. Instead, we want to say, okay, but why? What happens within that iambic pentameter? And really, why didn't I notice it in the first place? You didn't notice it in the first place, and it's good that you don't notice it in the first place, because the poem is taking you through these small, brief realizations at every turn and at every single line. One of those examples is in the final line. A 4-foot box and the pause, a foot for every year. So we have a Caesura there. We've got an example of blank verse. And we've got this realization, this epiphany that the eldest brother is looking down at his youngest sibling, who's only 4 years old and has been killed by a car, which is true of Seamus Heaney's younger brother. And so there's something that this emotion that shifts to us between sadness and just kind of utter heartbreak at the end is really, really important in how that's brought about by the pacing of the poem. This is not just something that Seamus Heaney did because poems are supposed to be in iambic pentameter. This is no mistake. Not when I say that poets create rules for themselves and try to follow those rules, and that's where the art sits. The important thing to come from that is that his writing has forced you to read this at the exact speed that he wants you to read this. You can't blow through this poem even if you tried. You have to read it exactly as he intends it. And he intends it based on how those lines are paced. And so that's something that becomes particularly important for you to recognize as you're reading through your FRQ. And so as you work through this in your own mind, think about that. Notice all the things that you notice. Notice all the things that I put as poll questions. What do I want you to notice? What does the poet want you to notice? What does the FRQ want you to notice? Now, speaking of FRQs, I really wanted to read through this one, A Story by Li Yi. And I want to make sure that we are able to do so. So I will, I do want you to take a look at this. If you keep this chat going on Discord, we'll ask you to do that in a little bit. So I do want you to definitely check this out. But we have another poetry cram coming up in a little while yet. And so we will certainly take a look at this one again. But think about for a moment, analyze how the poet conveys a complex relationship of a father and son through the use of literary devices such as point of view and structure. It's a lot of what we did today. Not about the father-son relationship, though. In the last one, there was an eldest brother and youngest brother relationship, as well as a father-son relationship briefly. But think about how we noticed structure impact the point of view between two characters, the speaker and a grasshopper, two characters, the speaker and the rest of the world, a falcon and a falconer. What did the structure of these poems take a look at? The speaker and the goddess of virtue. How do those relationships come about, and how do we recognize them through structure? The structure is not the thing you want to talk about. What you want to talk about is what you notice in that structure. Here's a shift. Here's a word that's important. Here's a line that's important. And here's how that importance lends itself in other spaces throughout the poem. That's the important thing. So do please take a look. You can see it's a fairly brief poem, and I will definitely go over it with you in the future. But as we get out of here, I want to just make sure that you are able to pull away these connotations. What is it that you can take from any word? What's the feeling that comes to you from it, and how does that feeling pop up in other spaces, and how does it help you to recognize different shifts? If you have one connotation, how do you find yourself feeling something else later on in the poem? Line breaks are a great place to notice those attitude shifts. And those last words on anything, a line or in the whole poem, they're there for some emphasis. What's being emphasized there? Punctuation as well. We saw the em dash. We saw a comma creating that caesura. What are the places where your breathing and your pacing are affected by how the author has written the poem? They're not doing it by accident. They're making specific choices, and those choices are the things that you get to talk about. Use all of those things and create bullet points for yourself to try to help create an outline for yourself very quickly. As always, be sure to keep this conversation going. Join us at our various social at Think5able, and make sure to jump on to Discord with one another, with Gayatri, with this poem. See what else you can bring to that space. But I hope you have a really restful rest of your evening, and I hope that you have a very successful week. And I look forward to meeting with you all again on Friday evening. All right, so have a good one, y'all.